Good afternoon, everyone. Before we start, we want to acknowledge that we gather on the traditional land of the Southern Paiute peoples, past and present, and honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. My name is Sasha Thompson. I am the Inclusion Marketing Lead for Amazon Web Services. And I welcome you to our second session today, our We Power Tech session on AI and bias. We Power Tech was started in 2017 as a platform to make sure that we include all underrepresented technologists in this space. We also want to provide a platform for underrepresented technologists to be seen and heard. And so this is the third year that we are presenting content at the intersection of diversity and technology. And so I am very excited to bring this panel to you. And at this point, I will pass it on to my colleague, Dr. Nashley Cephas.
Thank you so much, Sasha. How's everybody doing today? It's good. I'm glad you all decided to come to the session, and we're really excited that all you all are interested in what we have to say. So as she mentioned, I am Dr. Nashley Cephas, and I am an applied science manager at Amazon. I've been at Amazon a little over 3 years now. For the first 2.5 years, it's kind of interesting how I got into Amazon. My startup was called PartPick. I was the chief technology officer for it. Was acquired by Amazon in 2016. We were based in Atlanta, Georgia. And so our entire team joined Amazon for the past 2.5 years. Anybody ever used the Amazon shopping app? Anybody raise your hand? Okay. So there's a little camera button to the right of the search bar. If you click on that, you can point your camera at different things like my shoes, his watch, the chair, and it'll try to find it. And so that's what my team worked on, visual search for the first 2.5 years. And then as of the past 7 months, I've been leading the fairness and biases team in AI for AWS AI. And so that's kind of how I got here. And I have two wonderful panelists with me today. I'm just going to ask if they introduce themselves.
My name is Prem Natarajan. I head a large part of the AI enterprise within Alexa. I joined Amazon about a couple of years ago, less than a couple of years ago. I was at USC, University of Southern California before that, and at a company called BBN Technologies, which was later acquired by Raytheon. It was Raytheon BBN Technologies before USC. I've been in the field of applied AI or machine learning for better part of 2.5 decades. And I find it exciting, this is in some sense the third coming of AI. There's been ups and downs as we will talk through during the session. I'm super excited at how sticky it is this time around and how many applications are actually making a difference in everyday life and everyday convenience. And there are many other technological evolution factors that have sort of brought us to this point. And I think it's appropriate that as a technology, whether it's AI or anything else, becomes this pervasive and this influential in our everyday experiences, that we talk about aspects such as fairness, such as the ethics of the technology, how it should be applied, etc. So in some sense, the fact that we have these kinds of sessions and workshops on fairness and bias associated with AI and machine learning, to me is testimony to the fact that AI and machine learning have now become central to our lives and to our enterprises and to our industries and everything that we do. So with that, I'll sort of look forward to the rest of the conversation and welcome to you all to this session.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dr. Nicole Turner-Lee. I'm going to try really hard not to fall off this chair while I'm up here. I obviously don't work for Amazon because I'm wearing formal DC clothes. I'm a fellow at the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institution. I'm a PhD in sociology. And some may wonder why a sociologist is sitting up with two scientists, and I would say because I'm supposed to be here. And what I do is actually work on equity when it comes to artificial intelligence tools and any type of technology. Working on a book on the digital divide in the United States, which involved a 7-city tour. And in the area of what we're going to talk about today, I'm particularly interested in how we actually take into account systems of oppression and discrimination and racism and sexism, and how computers are not inherently equal. And in fact, they are actually inherently biased. So I spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C., figuring out ways that we actually create more equity around these tools as technology transforms the way we live, learn, earn, love, and do everything, just about everything else. And so I spent a lot of time just thinking through those things nationally and look forward to this conversation. At Brookings, we're a 100-year-old think tank, a global think tank, and the area in which I serve is one of 6 areas, but follow us. We actually, just a shameless plug, have an AI bias paper series that is available on our website looking at areas of ethics, governance, bias, and national security.
It's excellent reading. I read it all the time.
Yes, yes. So I want to dig in a little bit deeper, and I'm assuming that if you're all at this talk, you know what AI is. I know, don't be afraid if you don't. That's okay. But I'm just curious if we can dive a little bit deeper in what is AI? Like, how do you define AI exactly?
So, you want to go first? Okay. So, let me introduce a distinction that I've recently been making in my own mind between AI and machine learning first. So, we commingle those terms, we use them together all the time, and they often now are used interchangeably. But I think of AI as a capability. Whether it's the ability to recognize speech, which is like I listen and then I transcribe, it's a human capability, and machine learning as the techniques, as a set of techniques that, this is going to fall again. So as the set of techniques that enable us to deliver that AI capability. I think one of the big sort of revolutions, yeah, thank you. One of the big sort of transformative changes we've seen in the last decade, especially since 2012, is that there is this one machine learning technique, or like it's an umbrella technique, you call it deep learning, and there's a sort of compact set of variations of those techniques that people are exploring, that has had the ability to power many different types of AI, whether it's conversational AI, whether it's computer vision, whether it's forecasting. And so for the first time, we now have a platform kind of machine learning technique that the whole world is using. We call it deep learning. And that deep learning technique is allowing us to deliver these many different AIs. So for me, AI is something that packages a capability that I can exercise directly. I don't have to train. I just sort of interact with it, and it does something for me automatically without humans in the loop.
And I would actually agree with that technical definition of what AI is and machine learning distinctions, because I think we do put them in an umbrella. I mean, at the end of the day, when we talk about artificial intelligence, we're talking about the umbrella of autonomous systems, whether it's connected cars or other systems that actually run off our artificial intelligence metrics, right? But we're also talking about machine learning algorithms, and oftentimes, you're right, people put those together. But I want to go a little deeper, I think, on what Prem said, that how we got here. You know, we got here about 5 years ago. Many of us were talking about this thing called big data. And big data at that time was pretty much a conversation that was enabled around the Internet of Things. So we wanted to know if we place sensors in certain places, would they actually be able to give us some intelligence about their placement? Now, fast forward just 5 or 6 years later, and I use that time frame primarily because I was sitting at the Federal Trade Commission when they were doing a workshop on big data, and we weren't talking about AI. We fast forward now, all of us in this room contribute so much data to the ecosystem that we've created, I think, this intelligence that's able to not only harness what they know about us, but what they don't know or they infer. So I'll just give you an example. I love me some black boots. I'm wearing them now. I think I should have worn some flat shoes because if I fall, it's gonna be a problem. I love it when I get a recommendation for black boots. That helps because the computer knows that I purchased black boots. I like it when the computer tells me that I need to purchase something for my daughter, who's a 13-year-old, who's very hard to shop for, because they look at how I purchase. But what I don't like is when they actually associate my black boots with me being a female, and my purchases for my daughter with me being a mother. Because then what begins to happen is, because of AI, I then get served ads as a black woman who may have a child. And if you go deeper in terms of my digital footprint, you may find out how I purchase, how I bank, where I go to eat, who I associate with, who I network with. And then that's where we see these artificial intelligence systems become even more, human cognizable than we've ever seen them before, right? They do things today that we could not even imagine. I used to tell people, I come home when I was in high school and I watched 3 cartoons: the Jetsons, the Flintstones, and of course, Fat Albert. The Jetsons are here, and poor Fred, his car on the rock is gone. And poor Fat Albert, I don't know what happened to him. Well, I do, but I'm not going to say it here, right? But we do know what happened. But I think to Prem's conversation, right, it's this volumes of data naturally that have actually made these systems much more energized and activated than we've ever seen them before.
Yeah, so Nicole, she brought this up. You jumped in there a little bit quicker than I thought about these algorithms being biased. You said they are inherently biased. Now, there's a lot of controversy around that statement as far as I've heard the argument that algorithms aren't biased, the people are. I've heard the argument that it's really the data that can be biased. I actually work with facial recognition, so we deal with that all the time. Finding very well-balanced data sets is a big problem. It has been for a while. It's an industry-wide problem. I've also heard that there can be biases that exist in the algorithm. For example, when we use facial recognition, in some algorithms, we can find that if people are smiling, we automatically associate them with being a woman. And if they're frowning, we see trends them being associated as a male. And then what do you think about, there's only binary genders, but what about non-binary? So there's a lot of issues that you can look into and think about. But what do you have to say? Let's just jump right in there. Are algorithms biased? I want to hear from both of you all.
Yeah, I mean, you want to go first?
Sure. So I'll make a few different points on this topic of algorithms being biased. So there's going to be a lot of variation across algorithms because algorithms are not like a monolithic species. I mean, there's many, many algorithms. You go to one end of the spectrum, you write a bunch of rules, and you basically codify your own opinions in the form of an automatic system. And for sure, it's biased because each one of us is biased. And then you go from that to the other end of the spectrum where it's learning from data. And the question is, are these algorithms inherently biased? And it's hard to tell because there's no algorithm without the data that's used to train the models that are used by the algorithms, et cetera. So I think it's useful to look at them together too. There's a separate sort of policy issue, a different aspect to looking at the algorithms. But as an engineer, I try to look at them as a system, like what is the algorithm delivering with the data that's being used to train it. And a common excuse that all of us do use when we're sort of growing up in the machine learning space is to say, algorithms and models can only be as good as the data that's used to train them. And so a bunch of researchers said, let's test that hypothesis. Are they as good? We like to say they're as good as the data, but let's test out that hypothesis. Are they as good as the data used to train them? And you can look at Kai-Wei Chang's paper, best paper, EMNLP from 2017, and a few others in that ilk. And the surprising discovery was actually algorithms can amplify the biases in data. Right? So in that sense, I think I would agree that algorithms can be biased because they're adding to the bias that exists in the world. So they are capable of adding to the bias. They're also capable of reducing the bias in the world. So if you look into this whole field of work that we now call invariant representations, and for those of you who are working in this area, there's this burst of energy in this area called adversarially invariant representations, where the whole idea is to learn as conservatively as possible from the data and only learn that much from the data that helps you perform the specific task that you're assigning to the algorithm, and not use other aspects of the data that might just improve performance on a test set, which could then optimize for those biases and amplify them. But instead, you're only learning as much as required to do this task. And with deep learning, again, it turns out you can set up these loss functions so that you can learn representations that are as conservative as possible. Does that mean that these conservative representations don't have any residual bias? Of course not. They still have bias. And that's why there's a future for deep learning researchers in that we have these aspirations. Our North Star is to have as unbiased a system. The last point I'll make on that, queuing it up for the rest of the session, is I increasingly think that the real question that we all have to answer together is, can a combination of humans and algorithms be both more efficient and less biased than either one of them? And that, I think, is going to be sort of the next frontier that we're going to explore.
So I'll go back and kind of, and I do agree with a lot of what Prem has said, right, when it comes to can algorithms be biased. I do want to continue to say affirmatively yes. Let me tell you why. One, in the development stage, we all bring our historical values and norms to the table. If we're a woman, if we're African American, if we're a white male, if we're a white woman, if we're, somebody that grew up in the city or the country, whatever you think about the world, your paradigm actually impacts the way that you look at the model and you design the model. So let me give an example, and I am no way giving any indictment on any company when I share this. There is evidence of search queries where faces are to be beautified as part of games that we all play on the internet. And when they're photoshopped, in this one particular case, they were photoshopped to resemble European faces, whereas people of color who put their image in, their jaws were narrowed, their skin was lightened, and when it was traced back to why this was happening, it was because the developer didn't think about it anyway else. There are search queries where African American searches are put in. There was a search just a couple years ago between happy teenagers. The happy teenagers delivered search results for happy smiling white teenagers and mugshots for black teenagers. There are algorithms that may be designed to actually help in word search associations or even on employment algorithms. But at the end of the day, they actually create some type of bias where women are rejected based on the fact that their resumes say married or they went to a women's college. Just a couple of weeks ago, there was a healthcare algorithm based on the features that were inputted that was denying special programs to African Americans based on a feature that was not defined by race, but the amount of dollars that people of color actually contributed to healthcare. And that variable landed up kicking out African American patients, and it was on the front page of the New York Times. And so when you start to compile, I think, these egregious acts of discrimination in many respects, you begin to say, where does it start? And I do agree and believe that we have to diversify workforces to ensure that we have a seat at the table for everybody. It's very hard to develop a pain threshold algorithm for women if the developers are all men. Sorry, guys. You don't know the pain we went through in birth, childbirth. You cannot tell us what that feels like. You have to have inclusive tables. When it comes to the training data, just like Nashley said, you have to be concerned about that. There's a criminal justice algorithm that may have accuracy in determining which defendants should be released and which defendants should be detained. But the data in which it relies upon is primarily criminal justice data that over-incarcerates African American men. So when you rely upon that data, what happens? You generate search results because of their overrepresentation in that data set, and as a result, they are unfairly processed in the criminal justice system. We can turn around and say, well, it's less than 20% of African American males going to jail, perhaps it's just 1%. That's still too many. The trade-offs with that kind of bias, I think, workforce, training data, and I think the third piece is, where do people come in and actually provide information that's not them? It's the last point I'll make, and Prem knows what I'm talking about. The other challenge that we have when we talk about bias algorithms, we know historically that people of color are less able to get credit, conventional credit. And so their digital profile, like my boots and my daughter's shopping, may generate certain inferences about that person that may deliver to them a 39%, 29% credit card. I don't know about you, but if I get a credit card offering before knowing the interest rate, I click on it. When I click on it and it's 29% based on what that computer model has said, I no longer receive other things that are lower because there's no counterfactual data. So let me give you a real quick example of that. I was sitting at a workshop one time on AI, and the Omega Psi Phi Black fraternity was celebrating their centennial anniversary. And the researcher told us to take a look at the screen and just tell us what you see. Within 10 seconds, ads popped up that said, get your arrest record, and the highest interest credit card was marketed. Simply because the way the data was inferring who the audience was, that's how they were targeted. As a result of that, they wouldn't know how to recalibrate the algorithm because people who sit beside each other in this opacity of the internet don't know how decisions are made. And so I would suggest to all of you, there is bias that we actually have to deal with if we don't want to amplify stereotypes to sort of redress the equality that we already litigated. Why go back and do that again? I'll stop there because you know I have stuff to say on facial recognition, but I'm going to stop right there. As you can tell, I'm like a black preacher. I say what I want to say, and I say it loud, right? But I think that these are actually real common concerns of why a sociologist sits next to engineers in talking about these issues.
Right, exactly. No, that was a really good example of some of the consequences that can occur as a result of biases in the data and algorithms. Prem, this question is for you. I'm curious more so on the Alexa AI side in terms of language processing and speech. Could you talk a little bit more about some of the possible consequences of biases in that technology as well?
I'll just talk about it more generally in the context of speech and language, not in the context of one particular product that I think sort of diminishes the issue in a way. Some of the consequences of algorithms that have not been appropriately designed or trained or configured are that speech recognition, in this case, again, using the thing, you're sort of maybe not as good as your data, but you are constrained by your data in some sense. And so if your data only comes from a certain population, then your speech recognition will work well for that population. Now, I'll just segue to make a point, which is I think it's useful to look at this whole discussion about fairness in AI from two perspectives. One is doing good with AI, and the other is building good AI. Right? I think building good and better AI will continue to be a North Star for us for years to come, for decades to come. Doing good with AI should be something we're doing now. And the good news is actually a lot of good is being done with AI, whether it's for combating different kinds of social scourges, et cetera. We'll get to it later in the talk. But coming back to speech recognition, if we are doing good with conversational AI, in that certain people who can't get up and move around can have access to certain facilities by just sitting in the chair and asking for it. If that AI does not work equally well for different demographics, then we are in some sense depriving certain demographics of the advantages of technological progress that's happened. So that's very much top of mind. Another important aspect is not just in terms of consuming the user's query and understanding it, but also generating responses, right? How do we generate responses that are culturally appropriate, that are demographically appropriate? So that's another area of research for us. And you've seen recently, we've announced new custom voices that you can use. So far we only had one voice. This is coming back to Alexa now. There are other voices, and you should see us continue, and you should expect us to continue, and you should hold us to that standard of continuing to make sure that there's more choice in terms of how this conversational AI sounds, because we all find different sounds comforting or energizing, et cetera. And so we need to, that's the next sort of organic evolution for this technology. But even in terms of generating, one of my PhD students, Emily Sheng, can go search for her recent paper, my own shameless plug, right? And so at EMNLP in 2019, was looking at the biases in generating text, even with some of the new super powerful models that generate really good text. In fact, I would argue that the more something is human-like, the higher the standard of fairness that we have to hold it to, because it starts convincing us that it's real, and so we start following it with a greater intensity and greater engagement than otherwise. So I'll close this particular piece nationally with the following. An important part of research in fairness is to recognize that however much you're trying to do this research in fairness, if you're developing the technology, there's always going to be some inherent confirmation bias in you. You're going to want to sort of see it in a certain light. So recognizing that, we actually started this, so I initiated this program with NSF on behalf of Amazon, the NSF Amazon Fairness in AI Research Program. We should see new announcements made from NSF sometime in the next month or two, I guess. Selection is entirely up to them. But we wanted to build an academic community that is thinking about how to measure fairness. What is fairness in the context of many different applications? What are the different perspectives on fairness? And the reason I wanted to mention it is I want to say, even though it started off as a partnership between a computationally oriented group at Amazon and the computational part of NSF, The social sciences part of NSF is also now part of it. They're funding a part of it. And so, and a lot of the proposals are actually multidisciplinary. And so we're making sure that that too is an integrated perspective.
That's a good thing. Can I say something on the voice thing real quick?
Oh, yeah, sure.
I mean, I think what Prem is talking about in terms of what companies are actually doing to address bias is right on, right? One, you have to start with the presumption that it's there. And a recent paper that we wrote really starts with this bias impact statement. Do you have enough people around the table that can help you discern what the potential unintended consequence will be? I tell people when it comes to bias generally or the discrimination that we actually see in the online space, I'm okay with you recommending the fact that I like black shoes, black boots, it don't matter what kind they are. I'm not okay if it deals with my credit. So there's this 80-20 rule. What are the 20% of areas that companies need to pay attention to when it comes to fairness? You know, employment, maybe one. Housing, maybe one. Advertising, maybe one. You know, figure out what that wish list is. Right now, and I think I'm speaking to the right crowd, technology has created what I call the wild, wild west. Right? It's this area of permissionless forgiveness versus permissionless innovation. Years ago, a friend of mine had permissionless innovation was around, you know, the fact that we could create just about anything that technology could solve. And that's really the purpose of what technology was about. But now, when we make mistakes, we say we're sorry. We're sorry that that happened to women. We're sorry that this happened to X. And we're ahead of the schedule, like Prem said, where we can actually avert some of the disparate impacts that collectively communities will have. And I think it's important to go in with a fairness model that also allows companies to say, what is the trade-off if this goes wrong? What will happen to that subject? And I have to tell you, in the technology space, in my research, your basis for existence is on consumer trust. It is not people going into a store and buying something and saying hello to their, favorite sales representative. It's whether or not they feel comfortable on your platforms, and it's a trustworthy type of AI, which is a concept that we use at Brookings, where they know that the company is acting responsibly and being a good steward of your data, while at the same time being inclusive and collaborative on that 20% of use cases that have potential detrimental effects. So I agree with you. The voice stuff, we see it all the time. I'll give you a really great example. In a senior assisted living unit, they are using voice-activated systems. One is Eastern European, senior citizen, predominantly. One is African American. The Eastern Europeans don't like using it because they feel like no one understands what it's saying. The device doesn't understand what they're saying, particularly when they're talking fast. The African Americans, they sometimes don't like it because they're also talking in their own different dialect. We have a dialect. You come to my house. I'm actually from New York, which is why I talk a little faster, right? And it may not pick up on that. And so I agree with you. We have to figure out ways to create customizable training sets that look at a variety of scenarios so everybody can benefit from the tech.
Yeah, so I think you all bring up really good points there. And I'm from the South. I'm from Mississippi, so everything is tough for me as far as voice is concerned. But, I am a technologist, and I'm very passionate about, AI and what it can do, the good of what it can do. I think also, and we'll touch on that in a minute, but I think, let's talk about face rec, right? So let's just get it out. All right. So, of course, that is something that I work on. I've noticed the importance, especially having been on the recognition team with AWS, on how many different stakeholders there are. So there are scientists, there are VPs, there are leaders, there are public policy, there are people in government, there are people all across the board, as you mentioned. So what is the importance, especially in terms of face recognition and face analysis technology, that it means to bring so many different types of people to the table?
So it's interesting on the facial recognition side, right? This is one of the hot areas that we actually deal with in Washington, D.C., because it has policy implications. I mean, one thing to actually know is that this is not a new technology. We've always used some type of facial recognition, whether it was, early days in the military and, just general consumer applications of it. The challenge today, as we talked about, that AI has become much more ubiquitously deployed, that these tools are actually being picked up and they're being developed and sort of placed into the market and used by third-party actors that may not be well-intentioned. And so what does that mean? It's a couple of arguments I'll break down for this group, and then I think they kind of diffuse some of the discussion around facial recognition. First, there's the conversation around whether or not the technology is actually accurate enough to be deployed. So just last week, I had my hair in braids. I've talked to multiple companies that tell me as an African-American woman, it cannot recognize different hairstyles for black women. So as a result, the technology doesn't pick up on certain attributes in the facial analysis side of it before it even recognizes. Other areas, there's research that's out there that when it comes to facial recognition or facial detection, the technology is not advanced enough to pick up different hues of skin color and skin tone. As a result, African-American men get misidentified as African-American women, people with darker skin tones, and this has implications. There are facial recognition systems in autonomous vehicles that will hit a black boy before it hits a tree, simply because it cannot see the different cues in the 100% accuracy in which it was developed. So what does that mean? When you put a technology that has technical flaws, you run the risk of being wrong, particularly if you're law enforcement and you want to catch a criminal and you say, that girl in the gray dress with the black boots looks like the criminal because it has not accurately picked up my picture. Consequence, we all know what happens. I get arrested and I fall into the system that already discriminates against my people. So that's the technical side. On the other side of facial recognition, the data sets in which it uses is either over-representative of particular populations or it's underrepresentative. So I gave recently some talks of Homeland Security, and I gave it to them on the facial recognition used for deportation, right? Because they're going to driver's license and passports and other things to actually pick up on images, but at the same token, those data sets are discriminately not in the favor of people of color. So you're gonna find me somewhere in this database. And if you find me, you're gonna use that as a tool to arrest me. Now, it's not to say, and this is where I think the balance comes in, that facial recognition is not for good purposes. We would not have found the Boston Marathon bomber if it wasn't for facial recognition. There are criminals who are bona fide criminals that we need to pick up that facial recognition does help us with. But we have to have guardrails for the appropriate use when it comes to these innocuous situations. I was telling a company, I think I have a little problem that if I change my hair, I may not be able to get into my phone. That might be a problem, right? But I have a worse problem if I'm misidentified in a database simply because the technology is not correct. And I think companies like Amazon are starting to think through how do you take the products that you've actually designed to be run in an environment of a laboratory at a confidence level at this, but then how do you manage it when it actually gets out the door? How many of you have kids in here? You tell the kid one thing in the house and they just do something different when they get in the street, right? That's just how it works. And when it has implications on facial rec, we incarcerate more. And again, I want to go back to, because we had a panel at Brookings and it was really interesting. The gentleman who spoke was an NSF grantee. He said, Nicole, there are times when facial recognition and facial detection is good for the identification of chronic disease. You can look in the face and you can now see, due to the technology, where there might be the beginnings of some type of disease that is showing up, like they say in your eyes or in your cheeks or in your skin tone, whatever the case may be. But we are having the most problem on the public policy side because of the guardrails that are lacking in terms of how do other entities use this technology in ways that create a fair playing field for everybody. I'll just say this, the last thing on facial recognition, and this is something that we do in the area of privacy. If a kid does something at the age of 16 and his face is still in the system, does that mean that he's still a criminal at 25? And that's, again, one of the areas in which I think, and I really don't blame one particular stakeholder, as you said, nationally on this, I think that the technology that we're actually experiencing, this is fourth industrial revolution, is just so new and it's so quick that we're all trying to pick it up for our own purposes without really having a conversation around where are there areas where it may generate unintended consequence.
Yeah, and I'll just add, at Amazon, we are definitely working on these issues, especially with the face recognition. That's actually my team, and we're working on, another thing we're working on is being more transparent. So yeah, you may make mistakes, you may not be, totally 100% all the time, but if we're honest about where we are, lacking. I think we can start to begin the conversation of, how can we improve? That's exactly what we're doing, and I work with the public policy team as well, and I work with Nicole too. We're actually friends, so it's not like we don't like each other.
Can I say something else? I think what you just said, the last part, you work with, part of what happens in these technologies that we work in a silo, right? So as developers, we may develop it and think, and again, I was on a panel recently with a scientist who said the technology has gotten better because we're actually using images that make sense. His images were mugshots. And I'm thinking in my head, you're still creating, I guess, a non-inclusive data set that's time-stamped that may tell you in terms of, the distance between the eyebrows and the length of the forehead, but it's still oversampled on a particular population. And so I think that's why these conversations are critical, to have the sociologist with the engineer, the ethicist, the privacy person, the lawyer, so that you can actually have well-rounded conversations on how that's deployed.
Oh, yeah. Education is a big part of what I think is needed. And I've been actually on Capitol Hill speaking with members of Congress about the technology, and they just have no idea how it works most of the time, most of the people we talk to. So how can we begin to make policies and regulations on things that people don't understand, and that law enforcement, for example, may be misusing or miseducated about the technology? So that is a big piece as well. And so I want to kind of shift the conversation a little bit. We talked about a lot of the consequences and, the good and the bad. I want to tie this back to, We Power Tech, and actually how do we increase the diversity of our teams to maybe try to, avoid some of these issues in the future with these technologies. And so I'm just curious to hear from both of you all on that.
So I think you've touched upon one of the most challenging aspects of my job as well, which is constituting teams, high-performing teams, and then making sure that many different perspectives are represented on it. On this one, I really think there's only one answer, which is you've got to expand your network, bring more people into your network, and then you've got to put more effort into outreach. The biggest my take on this is, just as you were saying, we oversample certain things, et cetera. Over time, methods for recruiting talent have sort of optimized for finding where I think is the highest payoff in terms of extra dollars that I put into recruiting talent, right? And that's created a certain set of recruiting channels, recruiting mechanisms, and long-standing relationships for recruiting, right? I mean, all of these come into play. And so when you're not part of that sort of system where you have these, you're part of these channels, the outreach that has been optimized over decades to do, et cetera, now that we recognize that these are some limitations, I think some of the things that we're doing is increasing outreach. The only way to combat this goes back to this education thing that you were talking about. And there are multiple problems here. Even when we do this outreach, there is this general sense you can't be it if you can't see it kind of phenomenon that one of my friends in academia taught me about, right? And so, and what this does is it places a tax on some of the people who can be role models in some of these outreach activities, because now in order for us to show those role models, we are now leaning in more and more on the same sort of talent that we're trying to hire, and now that becomes a distraction from their mainline thing. So I see this as a sort of overall issue, and the only way out of it, in my mind, is to do more outreach, is for all of us to be more engaged, all of us to develop a more inclusive attitude. Technology could be an answer to some of those outreach problems, because we can amplify our outreach efforts through technology, whether it's through the creation of specific social media outreach programs that work for certain things. But honestly, I'd be lying if I said there is a simple solution to this, I know where to tap it because this would be a solved problem. This is a challenge. The most important thing I can say on that front is that this is a challenge that we live every day and we're actively dealing with every day, and we're trying to make sure that it doesn't remain a challenge in a few years from now.
So this is a difficult one for me because so I was part of that conversation and movement, like, okay, teach the babies, make sure all the kids in America have access to STEM. We got to make sure we keep up with China. That's going to take too long, right? There's too much going on in the tech space that we actually need people to have a seat at the table now. Obviously, I'm here. Hello, my mother wondered what I was going to do with a sociology degree. Well, here you go, right? There are people of different disciplines that can sit at the table that are not engineers that can be very valuable to the conversation. Political scientists, sociologists, anybody in social sciences. And why is that? Because we're taught to think differently. Engineers are taught to think in terms of, linear relationships and what's the causal relationship between A and B. I'm taught to think in a circle. How does the system affect that? If you're a political scientist or economist, you're just taught to think differently than I do. And that's a whole other issue in terms of economists, in terms of how they see the world. But at the end of the day, they all bring good value. The paper that I referenced, it took us a year at Brookings. It was a sociologist, a lawyer, and an engineer. I thought I was just going to die. That paper was like the longest paper that ever came out of Brookings because I wanted to talk about society, the engineer wanted to talk about the models, and the poor lawyer just tried to keep us from fighting, right? At the end of the day, the paper turned out really good because we all came to the table with a different perspective. So that's the diversity that comes with discipline. I think in terms of cultural diversity, it's necessary. Unfortunately, Silicon Valley's not doing well. There's a lot of discussion that's happened for the last 5 years on how to recruit more people of color to tech companies. Companies like Amazon, you guys sit at the top with other companies where the percentage of African Americans and women that work in frontline decision-making roles, Latina women, even Asian American, it's not great compared to the value and the number of people in your workforce. So what do you do about that? You got to go out of your way to find people. There are colleges, HBCUs. One of them is called Morgan State, and another one, North Carolina A&T. They're generating engineers at 90% levels, but those kids are being employed at rates of less than 5%. That's a problem. There are kids that actually are sitting right now trying to knock at the door and get in on an apprenticeship or an externship, but they don't know anybody that works at the company to be able to have that opportunity. There are women that could be valuable to the job, but if you use an artificial intelligence system that does not recognize them as part of the training data set, not talking about y'all, they'll be kicked out. And so what I'm just saying is we've got to do a better job of, like Prem said, being more aggressive and coming out of our comfort zone. A lot of it is based on unconscious bias. Some of it is based on the fact that I admit there are a few of us that don't want to move to Silicon Valley because we do need to have places to get our hair done and be able to be with people who are like us. We don't want to leave the South. But at the same token, you got to find ways to bring people in. And I think that's a really critical conversation that we need to have because the number of tech jobs are just going to grow vacant in the United States because of the lack of supply. Now, let me just say something about when you get people in. So when you get a person in, it's been noted at certain tech companies, not Amazon, that people of color feel isolated and alienated, women feel devalued, they lean in to the point that they fall over because nobody is paying attention. That's a problem, particularly in industries where we are changing the scope of how we do life, not business, but life for millions of people every day. And so what does that mean? Can I give you a good example? I'm sorry, Nancy, I talk a lot, but I just have to share this example.
Go ahead.
So I was in China a couple weeks ago, right? I was there for 1 week. I started in Shanghai, and I landed up in Beijing. Now, no offense to the Chinese people, a black woman walking around in braids in the middle of Beijing was not somebody that anybody ever saw. She know what I'm talking about. She's shaking her head. She know exactly what I'm talking about. So I'm walking around China, checking out all the sites, and everybody wanted to take my picture. I thought I was real important too. I said, well, I must look pretty or something, Prem. I was like, everybody want to take my picture. I was like, hey. First 5 pictures, it was quite okay. By the 6th picture, I was getting kind of annoyed. But then I was like, you know what? I'm going to do something different. When they ask to take my picture, I'm going to ask to take their picture too. And so what I have in my phone are 50 to 100 pictures of me with random people from China. But it's a beautiful thing because it taught me something about diversity. Even when you're at the company as a person of color, you're just there. You never ask for anything in return. You get your picture taken because you work in HR, but doesn't mean that you sit at the table and make decisions that actually contribute to products and services. We all need to be taking each other's picture. It's not a one-way street when it comes to diversity. And I think where we are in this country, if we actually don't do that, all of the things that we've been talking about in this panel could continue to happen because the people who are on those work teams don't contribute. Diversity is not just about having a seat at the table, having one woman, having one person who's less abled, having a person, who speaks a different language. It's about allowing them to cooperate and collaborate, allowing them to be there and be seen and be heard, much like what Natalie's doing. So that's my take on diversity today, that we just have to do a better job. And that's in every industry, but particularly tech, where the fine line of what is now normal happens among all of you. Who's at your table today? Think about that. And if the people that you sit at your table, and I work at Brookings, we're one of 4 fellows of color there, right? And we constantly have this conversation of who's sitting at the table, because that also influences the type of research that we put out. So that's, I think, the diversity question, in addition to the outreach efforts that Prem talked about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I happen to be the only Black female applied scientist at Amazon, by the way. And so, it's not something I'm proud of, but that is something that I hope will change, and that's something that we're working to change. I think also, it's often the burden is put on the underrepresented group to reach out and initiate and make that change and make themselves feel more included and raise awareness, but it really shouldn't be that way. I like what you said about it's really a group effort. If anything, it should be on everybody else. And so I think it's really important, a part of what I'm doing with the facial recognition and facial analysis team, I'm actually, I would venture to say I may be one of a very small percentage of even people who are born in the United States on the team, which, again, like, my team is great. They're great guys. I love them. But yeah, we can do better. And I think even beyond the point of, outreach and exposure, I have a nonprofit based in Jackson, Mississippi, to expose youth and just people in the community to technology. It's very passionate to me, because otherwise they have no access to it. They don't see it. Like you say, if you don't see it, how can you be it? And so I definitely relate to that. But I also think we could bring in, like, focus groups. Yes. We could do a better job at, even when we're annotating our data, who is annotating the data? Like, whose opinion are we getting on, is this a male or a female? Is this, what ethnicity is this person that we're looking at? How old is this person in terms of age, background, region? Ethnicity is a lot of different types of diversity that we can incorporate. And so I think wonderful points that both of you all made. You have something?
Yeah, can I say something on that too? I think it's good for this audience to know when it comes to the diversity question. This is a hardcore issue when it comes to representation. The statistics tell us that for African American kids and Latina kids, if they're not actually exposed to science and math before 6th grade, they're less likely to pursue a career in science and math. It was a research point that came out. I have a son who's 17 who's not a science guy, because if an African American boy in particular has a bad science or math experience by the time they're in high school, they're less likely to actually pursue that going forward. So I have a beautiful non-STEM kid who actually likes to write because he had a bad experience with a math teacher. And it's one of those things that we have to continue to take into consideration. And we have to create, I think, some cross-cultural combinations among different people who have different values around these disciplines. So I think reaching out to young people, coding as one of the second languages is really important as well, going forward. These are, again, for me, we can do things like that from a policy perspective of creating more engineers in the United States. We can do much better collaboration when it comes to our visa programs, to bring in different people to help work in this space. But generally, we have to just push the envelope so that we create cross-collaborative, inclusive communities. There's nothing better that comes out of having a Natalie on the team. Not so she sits up there and tells you, nah, that's not gonna work, I don't think so, nah, no. It's because she comes with a different perspective as a scientist. And I think each and every one of us, we want that every day. That's why I love doing this stuff. I've traveled all over the world, basically from the last 3 weeks, from Latin America to China, to someplace else, Europe last week. And what I find so interesting is that different cultures never hear us talk about these issues. So you have different conversations on what it means to have civil AI, or the human rights implications that we may not think about, or what does it look like with regards to technological features. You cannot do that in a vacuum by yourself. You can't. And you cannot do that if you never walk across the aisle or walk across the room to ask someone a question. And I think that's why this conversation is so critical, as we see these autonomous systems sort of guide us through these daily experiences that, in the end, impact people.
I'm going to segue off of something both of you said. One was about annotation or the data, and the other one is about all of, how do you make sure the AI, whether it's civil AI or something, works for everybody. I think the way in which sort of having these diverse, I think one of the ways in which technology limits itself is in the problems it chooses to solve. Okay, it's not necessarily that the solutions are defective or flawed. They could be, and they often are, but those can be improved much faster than picking the problems to solve, right? But when you start looking at it, for example, if you start looking at something from an accessibility perspective, then you start solving a different set of problems than you start solving if you're just looking at it in terms of maximizing the accuracy for a certain big group of folks. In the context of making AI work for everyone, I think one of the most exciting areas of work that's opened up that I'm personally excited about working in, and I have collaborators working with me on it, is about AI that learns in the field, right? So if the AI can learn through interaction with the user, whether passively or through active interaction with the user, now we're putting the power of making this AI as diverse as it can be, sort of with the crowd. And I don't think we're the only people working on it, but there aren't enough people working on this problem. And I think in order to bend the curve in terms of, if you look at data, a large group of people would have difficulty annotating dialects that they don't understand, right? And so, but the person who understands, so if you take that to an extreme and say everybody has a personal dialect, a personal way of speaking, and you would like that AI to adapt to you, this happens with humans. It's called entrainment. Somebody starts speaking with a certain lilt to their voice. Over time, you'll start saying that when you're interacting with them, you start speaking with that lilt. That's just because we all like to be liked. And so, and being like that helps the other person like us. And then they become more comfortable, then you have a more engaging conversation, and they're doing the same with you. In fact, the biggest example of that being a subconscious thing is that you never recognize when somebody else is doing it to you unless you sort of say, I know this is happening, I do research in this area, I'm going to start using a particular pattern and see if this person starts repeating, and the vast majority will. Even simple things, you walk down the hallway and you smile at somebody, the probability they'll smile back at you is in the high 90s, right? You just look at them, look away, they'll do the same. So very reciprocal beings, but in order for AI to become more useful, I think we have to bring it to the point, and there's a really exciting set of challenges to be solved on the AI front by looking at that problem space, where we're not thinking of AI as something we collect data, we train, we deploy, and like a car that rolls out of the parking lot, it starts depreciating from the moment the model is in production, but that's the start of its appreciation, that it actually starts gaining value from that point on. And so for those of you who are looking to say, what's a new exciting area, that's one that's super exciting to work in.
And I think you're so right. I think context matters, right? What you develop in the laboratory may not be the same as it resulted in, or the decision may not be the same when it's placed in a different context. So I think that's particularly important. But I also think Prem brings up, an area that we're not going to go into, which is this deep learning piece, right? The deep learning part of AI is what manipulated elections. It allowed people to do the type of distortion of speech and image recognition, and to place, I think, these subliminal messages that, essentially suppressed some people's right to vote because they felt that this was really speaking to them. And I think as the technology becomes more harnessed and perfected based on the repetitive actions of objects, places, and people, to your point, we have to look at their context. You know, I'll just bring in, as a Washington, D.C. person, we're interested in algorithmic transparency, as Ashley said. What is going into this model? How is it explainable in terms of what's in the black box? But honestly, not many people in Washington, D.C. are modelers. They wouldn't know what you were telling them. We're more interested in explainable outcomes. How did this decision get to a point where more people were denied credit, or more people were incarcerated, or elections were manipulated, or women were misjudged, or algorithm biased racially against black patients? We're interested in that, right? How do you get to those outcomes so that we create some parity in the world? I want to go back to what you said, right? It all starts with just having this framework, you said it earlier, for fairness, and how you actually judge fairness. And there are parts of it which are subjective, like I want to do the right thing as a developer, and there are parts that you just have to put guardrails in place because you have to recognize that not everybody will do the right thing when they have that in their hand. So it's just such an interesting conversation I think we're having here.
Yeah, no, this is wonderful. And we are getting ready to wrap up, so I do want to just have one last question. And you can answer this, you know, either way. So basically, what are you personally doing to help solve some of these issues, and or what can the people in the audience do to help with some of these solutions?
Yeah, I can share a couple of things that I am doing personally, again, within the professional context, because we're at a professional event, I'll just keep it in that context. I already mentioned that my perspective on this is there's so much you can do on fairness or transparency or interpretable AI, et cetera, on your own. But in order to find the right problems to solve, you need to bring a much larger community in, not because other people are less biased than you, but because each of us has our own biases, and hopefully the sum total of those blind spots sort of eradicates all the blind spots. Like, you know, our blind spots don't overlap, and therefore we actually get a good 360-degree view on things. So from that view, I've been saying there's a lot of stuff we're doing internally, which, you know, sometimes we talk about, sometimes we don't talk about on the fairness and interpretable AI piece. But the more important thing that we're doing, I think, are the externally focused things in terms of bringing in external perspectives. One, I won't repeat it again, just to give you the hook back to the previous comment I made, which is this program with the NSF. The whole goal there is for people to propose their own research programs. There's not a specific set of research problems being assigned to them. These are faculty members in academia proposing their own specific research vectors and fairness that they want to explore. Some of them are proposing ways of assessing the fairness of systems, et cetera, and hopefully it'll lead to the formation of a community that makes this a field, a proper scientific field. Right now, it's a little arcane in the sense it's an area of specialty, it's a bit of science and art blended together, and I think we make impact at scale when we're able to make it into an engineering kind of discipline where we know how to measure things, we know how to optimize things, et cetera. Second thing is, along the same track, we also launched this fairness in the Amazon Research Awards, has a fairness track. So people are welcome to submit proposals to that. We've received the first round of proposals. Unlike the NSF one, which is entirely, the selection is up to the NSF, we're not involved, we don't see the proposals. This, of course, is more directly us funding it, and so my hope is that we will find what the NSF is funding and say, what are the gaps there, what other perspectives would we like to see reflected in this debate. And the third component, which we can't talk about too much until we actually launch something, is the work that's happening internally in terms of fairness and fairness objectives in machine learning, or what kind of fairness objectives make sense for the specific set of technologies we're developing, et cetera.
So what am I doing now? I think I did a darn good job staying on this chair. As animated as I am, I'll probably need some help to actually get down when it's over, right? You know, in my work, I'm continuing to actually bring a different voice to this conversation. And so I talk a lot about this because these are issues that I care about as a sociologist, as a person who's part of a protected group, as a person who is able to sit at the table with engineers and other professionals and actually have a conversation around it that leads us to a different place. And so I spent a lot of time doing that, which is why Ashley and I and Prem actually and I have talked about stuff like this here at Amazon, and I go around and talk to different companies and different stakeholders around this. Why? One, I'm developing a model. How many of you have bought an appliance recently? I know it's Black Friday and it's Cyber Monday, like a washing machine or a dishwasher. Anybody ever do that and see the big yellow stamp that's on there, the Energy Star rating? So I'm working actually on a model which is sort of an Energy Star rating around algorithms. Given that companies like Amazon and others have to rely upon consumer trust, to what extent do customers know what goes into that to make the right decisions, and to the respect that you have companies that have developed fairness models. They do multiple testing. They have diverse work groups. And so I've been working on something that looks at standards that have already come through the federal agency like NIST, but what are other variables on the technical side, the consumer side, the academic side that can contribute to better algorithms? Like I said, if my facial recognition can't recognize me every time I change my hair and that's going to happen, then I want you to tell me that. Just like you will tell me if this washer will operate in how much water, how much electricity. Give me some transparency in that way. So that's a model that I hope to have out in 2020. Outside of that, and I do a lot, I'm also working on updating the civil rights laws to apply to the digital space. I think one area that we have as a starting point are things like the Fair Credit and Reporting Act, the Fair Housing Act, and the variety of civil rights laws that we've already passed. There should not be any machine learning, machine or autonomous system that breaks the law. And I think it actually works well for developers to know what those laws say, because you'll build better products that are not only in compliance, but they just allow for that equitable track. And I would say the third thing that I do is I try to educate policymakers who really don't understand this stuff. I've done like 2 hearings in the last 6 months. In every hearing, the questions get better. And I think they want to understand it, because policymakers are the representatives of people, but they can't keep up with this technology the way that we in this room use it as digital natives. So I spend a lot of time sharing my black shoe model with policymakers, because I think they understand that when it comes to context. And coming up with laws that don't stifle innovation. And I'll just say this, facial recognition has points where it's over-criminalized populations, but it's also helping us find missing and exploited children. And so I try to figure out ways that we can get balance, because the innovation is always going to be, like I said, the Jetsons have already defined the margin of error for the society in which we live. So we've got to figure out how to coexist and co-create in that space. So last shameless plug, I am writing a book. It's not on this. Hopefully it'll be on Amazon. 2020 Brookings Press on the Digital Divide. There is a chapter on AI, but that's actually nationally how I've been spending my time.
Wonderful. Please give our panelists a round of applause.